April 9th, 2025. The world holds its breath. President Trump has just announced another 50% tariff on China. This brings the total rate to 125%. Not a tax increase, an embargo. The world's two largest economies are about to functionally stop trading with each other. American importers don't know what rates will apply from week to week. Chinese exporters scramble to reroute cargo through third countries. Global supply chains seize up like an engine running without oil. Business leaders on both sides of the Pacific are begging their governments to pull back from the brink. But here's what almost no one realizes. We've been here before. Not in 2018, when Trump's first trade war began. Not even in the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union divided the world into spheres of influence. No, the real ghost haunting this rivalry is 500 years old. June 7th, 1494, a small Spanish town called Tordesillas. Two kingdoms at the western edge of Europe presume to divide the entire unknown planet between themselves. They draw a line from pole to pole, 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the east belongs to Portugal. Everything to the west belongs to Spain. The indigenous peoples who actually live in these lands get no voice. The rest of Europe gets no vote. Two small kingdoms, with the blessing of a Spanish pope, carve up a world they haven't even discovered yet. Sound familiar? Because what happened next, over the following 35 years, is almost beat for beat what's happening right now between the United States and China. The players have changed, the technology has evolved, but the script is ancient. And if history is any guide, we can predict exactly where this is headed. Let me introduce you to the characters in this 500-year drama. First, Portugal. Think of Portugal as the United States. Portugal is the established power, the methodical planner, the technological gatekeeper. For decades before 1494, the Portuguese had been pushing down the African coast, expedition by expedition, mapping every inlet, establishing trading posts, building relationships. They invested enormous sums. They developed superior maritime technology. They kept detailed records. This wasn't luck. This was strategy. In 1498, Vasco da Gama finally rounds the Cape of Good Hope and reaches India. The eastern sea route to Asia is open. Portugal quickly dominates the Indian Ocean through a combination of naval superiority and fortified trading posts. By 1511, they've conquered Malacca, controlling the strategic strait that connects the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Sound like anyone you know? The United States spent decades building the technological architecture of the modern world. The Internet, GPS satellites, semiconductor fabrication, advanced AI chips. These weren't accidents. This was the Chips and Science Act. This was DARPA funding. This was Silicon Valley venture capital. And just like Portugal, America guards this technology jealously. In October 2022, the Biden administration imposed sweeping export controls on advanced semiconductors to China. These weren't targeted at individual companies. They were designed to slow China's entire semiconductor industry. The advanced AI chips, restricted. Chip-making equipment, restricted. American citizens working with Chinese chip companies, they need special authorization. Portugal controlled the sea routes. America controls the chip routes. Both powers saw themselves as having earned their dominance through innovation and investment. Both believed they had the right to set the terms for everyone else. Now meet Spain. Think of Spain as China. Spain is the rising challenger, the circumventor, the one looking for alternative routes to break the monopoly. When Christopher Columbus returned from the Caribbean in 1493, Portugal was alarmed. For decades, they'd been methodically working toward a sea route to Asia via Africa. Now, Spain threatened to circumvent all of Portugal's careful planning by sailing west. Spain didn't have Portugal's systematic approach or superior navy, but Spain had ambition, resources, and a willingness to take enormous risks. China today is following the same playbook. The United States built the technological architecture of the modern world, but China is looking for ways around it. Can't access the most advanced chips? Build domestic alternatives. Can't use American AI models? Train your own. Can't compete on established terms? Change the game entirely. Made in China 2025, the push for technological self-sufficiency. Hundreds of billions poured into semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. China isn't trying to play by America's rules. China is trying to make its own rules. And here's the crucial parallel. Both Spain then and China now understood that accepting the established powers' monopoly meant permanent subordination. Spain couldn't let Portugal control all routes to Asian wealth. China can't let America control all advanced technology. The question that obsessed both kingdoms in the 16th century and both superpowers today is the same. Can the challenger find an alternative route? Or will the gatekeeper's monopoly hold? But why fight at all? What's the prize worth dying for? For Portugal and Spain, the answer was simple: the Spice Islands. The Moluccas, a tiny archipelago in what's now eastern Indonesia, 5 volcanic islands west of Halmahera: Ternate, Tidore, Moti, Makian, Bacan. These were the only places on Earth where clove plants grew naturally. Nutmeg grew on just 10 Banda Islands nearby. These spices were worth their weight in gold, sometimes literally. Think about what that means. A merchant who could buy spices directly from the Moluccas and transport them to Europe could make returns of several 100%, even accounting for the enormous risks. Even accounting for ships lost at sea, crews dead from scurvy, piracy, storms. The profit margins were so extraordinary that both kingdoms were willing to sail around the entire planet to get there. Today, the Spice Islands are the semiconductor industry, specifically the advanced chips that power artificial intelligence. The United States controls access to these chips through a combination of technological leadership and export controls. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company makes the most advanced chips in the world, using extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that only the Dutch company ASML can produce. China is blocked from purchasing these machines. Just like the Moluccas had a natural monopoly on clothes, Taiwan has a manufactured monopoly on the most advanced semiconductors. And just like 16th century spices, these chips are worth extraordinary sums. The AI industry is projected to be worth trillions. Whoever controls the production of advanced AI chips controls the future of computing, warfare, surveillance, automation, and economic productivity. Biden's AI diffusion rule, announced in January 2025, would have created a 3-tiered global licensing framework for these chips. Tier 1 countries, all American allies, would face minimal restrictions. Tier 2 countries could access chips through verified programs. The rest of the world? Locked out. This is Tordesillas for the 21st century, dividing the technological world into spheres of influence with the consent only of allied powers. China's response? Invest $200 billion to create a self-reliant chip industry. Pour $900 billion over a decade into AI, quantum computing, and biotech. Outspend the United States in strategic technologies. And here's where it gets interesting. In late 2025, a Chinese AI startup called DeepSeek released models rivaling American competitors. The shock wasn't superior performance, it was extraordinary efficiency. DeepSeek demonstrated that competitive AI could be trained using far less computing power than American companies employed. China found a way to make the journey with smaller ships. President Xi Jinping said in his 2026 New Year address that 2025 was the year China's technologies reached new heights. Alibaba launched frontier AI models, claiming to outperform Claude and DeepSeek on benchmarks. The question American policymakers are grappling with is the same one Portuguese officials faced in the 1520s. Can you truly block a determined rival from reaching the prize? Or do restrictions just force them to innovate more efficiently? So how do you fight a war over global dominance without actually going to war? In the 16th century, the weapons were papal bulls and naval power. Pope Alexander VI, conveniently Spanish by birth, issued the bull Inter Caetera in 1493. It declared that all land south and east of the Azores belonged to Spain. A subsequent bull, Dudum Sequidem, specifically included India in Spanish domains. This was economic warfare dressed up as divine mandate. Portugal rejected these terms. They had the superior navy, and both kingdoms knew it, so they negotiated directly, producing the Treaty of Tordesillas. No more papal mediation, just raw power and negotiation. But here's the key. The treaty only addressed the Atlantic Ocean and the Americas. It said nothing about Asia, nothing about what would happen when Portuguese ships sailing east and Spanish ships sailing west eventually met on the other side of the planet. That ambiguity would cause problems for decades. Today's weapons are tariffs, export controls, and emergency powers. Trump's first term established the playbook, Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods starting in 2018. The justification was unfair trade practices, forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, state subsidies. China retaliated with tariffs on American agricultural products, targeting states that voted for Trump. The tit-for-tat escalation became known as the trade war. But the real weapon was always technology restrictions. In 2019, Trump's Commerce Department placed Huawei on the entity list, cutting it off from American semiconductors and software. The justification was national security. Huawei's equipment could be used for espionage. This established a crucial precedent. The United States was willing to use export controls as a weapon against a Chinese company. Biden intensified this approach. The October 2022 semiconductor export controls weren't targeted at companies, they targeted China's entire advanced chip industry. Then came the AI diffusion rule, creating a global framework for who could access AI technology. When Trump returned in 2025, he weaponized the International Emergency Economic Act. February 1, 2025, Trump signs 3 executive orders imposing what he calls fentanyl tariffs, 10% on all Chinese imports, effective February 4th. The justification: China hasn't stopped fentanyl precursor chemicals from reaching North America. 2 weeks later, another 10% increase, 20% total. Then, Liberation Day, April 2nd, 2025. Trump announces reciprocal tariffs based on trade balances. For China, this means an additional 34% on top of existing tariffs. China retaliates immediately, targeting American coal, liquefied natural gas, agricultural equipment. The escalation is breathtaking. April 9th, Trump threatens another 50% tariff, total rates approaching 125%, a functional embargo. But then something interesting happens. On May 28th, a panel of judges rules Trump's use of the IEEP is illegal. A second court agrees the next day. The legal foundation for the entire tariff structure is challenged. This is the 16th century problem all over again. Portugal and Spain could draw lines on maps, but without accurate longitude measurement, they couldn't actually determine where those lines were. The technology didn't exist to enforce what they'd agreed to. Trump can impose tariffs using emergency powers, but American courts question whether a trade dispute qualifies as a national emergency. The legal technology doesn't support what he's trying to do. Both conflicts share the same fundamental weakness. The rules are ambiguous, the enforcement mechanisms are contested, and both sides are making up the playbook as they go. But China isn't just defending. China has its own weapon. April 4th, 2025. China introduces export controls on 7 heavy rare earth elements, plus all related compounds, metals, and magnets. This is China's counterpunch, and it's devastating. Rare earth elements are essential for electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, smartphones, defense systems. China dominates global supply. They produce, refine, and process the vast majority of the world's rare earths. The impact is immediate. Export volumes fall sharply in April and May. Car makers in the United States, Europe, and Asia struggle to obtain permanent magnets. Some are forced to cut production or temporarily shut down factories. Prices spike. European rare earth prices reach 6 times those in China. The Pentagon is alarmed. Rare earths are crucial for F-35 fighter jets, Virginia and Columbia-class submarines, Tomahawk missiles, radar systems, Predator drones, and smart bombs. October 9th, 2025. China escalates further. New export controls on rare earth elements, lithium batteries, and diamond technologies. These controls are more comprehensive. They restrict not just raw materials, but core processing equipment. This is designed to prevent technological leakage and preserve China's dominance in the entire value chain. Then, China deploys the nuclear option. They apply the Foreign Direct Product Rule for the first time. This enables China to regulate the sale of foreign-made products if they incorporate Chinese rare earth content or were produced using Chinese technologies. This is the same legal mechanism the United States has used for years to restrict semiconductor exports to China. Now it's being turned against American companies. The parallel to the 16th century is exact. When the Portuguese established themselves on Ternate in the Moluccas, forming alliances with that sultanate, Spain responded by establishing themselves on Tidore, forming an alliance with Ternate's traditional rival. The Spanish used local sultanates as a counterpunch to Portuguese naval superiority. Portugal couldn't match Spain's ships or experience, but they could exploit local power structures to create problems for their rival. China can't match American chip technology yet, but they can exploit their dominance in rare earths to create problems for American manufacturing and defense. Both strategies share the same logic. If you can't win on your opponent's battlefield, change the battlefield. By May 2025, both sides are exhausted. The tariff rates are unsustainable. American businesses are screaming. Chinese exporters are scrambling. Global markets are in chaos. So they negotiate. The Geneva Deal. Both sides agree to lower tariffs by 115% while retaining an additional 10% baseline. China agrees to remove retaliatory tariffs announced since April. The United States makes parallel concessions. It's a truce, not a resolution. Crucially, the deal is temporary, 90 days. Without further progress, tariff rates could spike again in August. Business leaders try to plan for an uncertain future. Do they invest in alternative supply chains? Do they wait to see if the truce holds? Do they bet on reconciliation or prepare for renewed warfare? The world holds its breath.
This is exactly where Portugal and Spain found themselves in the 1520s. They'd both reached the Spice Islands. Portuguese ships had arrived via the eastern route in 1512. Spanish ships, following Magellan, arrived via the western route in 1521. Both kingdoms claimed ownership. Both had established alliances with local sultanates. Both were preparing for conflict, but neither really wanted war. War was expensive. War was unpredictable. War might destroy the very trade they were fighting over. So they tried to negotiate. The Junta of Badajoz in 1524 brought together the finest cartographers and navigators from both kingdoms to determine where the anti-meridian, the line on the opposite side of the world from Tordesillas, should be drawn. The experts couldn't agree. Each side's calculations conveniently placed the Moluccas within their own hemisphere. The fundamental problem was that accurate longitude measurement was impossible with 16th century technology. Both sides were negotiating over a line they couldn't actually draw.
Just like the United States and China today are negotiating over technological dominance in industries that are evolving faster than policy can keep up. The question hanging over both eras is the same. Can you have a stable truce when the fundamental dispute remains unresolved? Let me tell you about Ferdinand Magellan. Magellan is Portuguese. He served his country with distinction in the East Indies. He's seen the Spice Islands' wealth firsthand. But King Manuel I of Portugal refuses to support his proposal for a westward expedition. So Magellan does something radical. He defects to Spain. He brings with him something precious, letters from his friend Francisco Serrao, who's living in the Moluccas. These letters describe the island's location, their wealth, their defenses. Serrao's information is intelligence gold. Magellan makes a bold claim to the young King Charles I of Spain. He claims the Spice Islands are so far east that they fall within the Spanish sphere if the world is divided in half. The Tordesillas line, extended around the globe, puts the Moluccas on Spain's side. It's a creative interpretation of geography, and it's exactly what Charles wants to hear. This is China's strategy today, played out in slow motion over decades. China has systematically recruited talent from Western universities and companies. The 1,000 Talents Plan offered generous incentives for scientists, including Chinese expatriates, to move to China and work on strategic technologies. China has absorbed Western know-how, reverse-engineered Western products, and invested enormous sums in domestic research and development. The goal isn't just to match Western technology, it's to create an independent technological base that doesn't depend on American goodwill. Made in China 2025 set explicit targets: 70% self-sufficiency in core technologies by 2025, dominance in 10 key sectors, including semiconductors and artificial intelligence, by 2049. Like Magellan, China is betting it can find an alternative route to the prize, and like Magellan, China is willing to take enormous risks to get there. September 20th, 1519, 5 ships leave Spain: the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Vitoria, Santiago, about 270 men. The crews are diverse: Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, German, Greek, French, African. This is a multinational venture, united by ambition and greed. They have no idea what they're getting into. The voyage is a nightmare from the beginning. After crossing the Atlantic, the fleet searches the South American coast for a passage to the Pacific. Weeks turn into months. One ship is destroyed. Mutineers try to take control of 3 vessels. Magellan crushes the mutiny and exiles the ringleader to an uninhabited island. The crew is running out of food, running out of patience, running out of hope. October 20th, 1520. They find it, the entrance to a strait at the southern tip of South America. They begin to navigate it, seeing bonfires lit by indigenous people on the shores. Magellan names it Tierra del Fuego, land of fire. The strait takes 38 days to navigate, 350 miles of treacherous waters, unpredictable currents, narrow passages between cliffs. November 20th, 1520, they emerge into a new ocean. Magellan names it the Pacific because it seems so calm compared to the Atlantic storms they've endured. He has no idea of its true size. Magellan believes the Spice Islands are perhaps a few weeks' sail away, maybe a month if conditions are poor. He's basing this estimate on the best geographic knowledge available, which drastically underestimates the Pacific's size. He's wrong by thousands of miles. The Pacific crossing takes 99 days, 99 days with no sight of land. The crew runs out of food within weeks. They eat rats, they eat sawdust, they eat leather from the ship's rigging, softened in seawater. Men die of scurvy. Men go mad from thirst and starvation. When they finally sight land on March 16, 1521, reaching Guam and then the Philippines, Magellan has demonstrated something extraordinary. The western route to Asia is possible, But he's also demonstrated that it's far more difficult, far more dangerous, and far more expensive than anyone imagined. China's technological journey mirrors Magellan's Pacific crossing in every detail. The route to technological independence is far longer and harder than Chinese planners initially estimated. Export controls have forced China to develop domestic alternatives for technologies that would have been easier to simply purchase. This takes time, it takes enormous investment, it produces many failures along the way. China reportedly delayed its 5-nanometer chip release until at least 2026. SMIC's 7-nanometer process isn't achieving good yields and faces reliability issues. These are real technological barriers, not easily overcome. But here's what American policymakers need to understand. The difficulty doesn't mean China will give up. If anything, the challenge has made China more determined. Magellan lost most of his fleet crossing the Pacific, but the one ship that made it home proved the route was viable. The cargo of spices that Victoria brought home to Spain in 1522, even after accounting for the lost ships, still turned a profit. That's all China needs, proof that the alternative route works, even if it's harder, even if it costs more, even if it takes longer than planned. Because the alternative is accepting permanent technological subordination to the United States. April 27, 1521, the island of Mactan in the Philippines.
Magellan has converted the chief of Cebu to Christianity. Now he's agreed to help this chief conquer a rival tribe. It's a political calculation. Demonstrate Spanish military superiority, secure alliances, establish Spain's credibility in the region. Magellan leads a small force ashore. The battle goes poorly. The Spanish are outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Magellan is hit by a poisoned arrow. His comrades retreat, leaving him to die on the beach. The great navigator, who sailed 3/4 of the way around the world, who found the Western Passage to Asia, dies in a minor skirmish over local politics. After Magellan's death, the expedition continues. 2 ships make it to the Moluccas on November 8, 1521, more than 2 years after leaving Spain. They load their holds with clothes, the precious cargo that justifies everything. Then they attempt to return. One ship, the Trinidad, tries to sail back across the Pacific. It fails. Portuguese forces eventually capture it. The other ship, the Victoria, under Juan Sebastián Elcano, takes the long route home, across the Indian Ocean, around Africa, up the Atlantic, deliberately avoiding normal shipping lanes to evade Portuguese patrols. September 6, 1522, Victoria arrives back in Spain. 3 years after departing, only 18 men remain of the original 270, but they bring 26 tons of spices, worth a fortune. They've proven the western route exists, but they've also proven it's barely survivable. Late 2025, DeepSeek releases its AI model. American AI experts are shocked, not because DeepSeek's model is dramatically better than American competitors, but because it was trained using far less computing power than anyone thought possible. The assumption underlying American export controls was that denying China access to the most advanced semiconductors would prevent Chinese companies from building competitive AI. This assumption just got challenged. DeepSeek found a shorter route, a more efficient method, a way to do more with less. Just like Magellan proved you could reach Asia by sailing west, DeepSeek proved you could train frontier AI models without cutting-edge American chips. The ships that survive don't have to be the biggest or the best equipped, they just have to make it home. And suddenly, American policymakers are facing the same uncomfortable realization Portuguese officials faced in 1522. The Challenger found an alternative route. It's harder, it's more expensive, but it works. Trump's AI czar, David Sachs, estimated China is maybe 3 to 6 months behind the United States in AI development. But no one is certain what that means or whether it matters. If China can train competitive AI models using less advanced hardware, then American export controls haven't prevented Chinese AI development. They've just forced Chinese engineers to innovate more efficiently. This is the nightmare scenario for technological gatekeepers. Your restrictions don't stop your rival. They make your rival smarter. October 30th, 2025. Busan, South Korea.
APEC summit. President Trump and President Xi Jinping meet for about 1 hour and 40 minutes, their first face-to-face encounter since 2019. Trump calls the meeting amazing and rates it 12 out of 10. Chinese readouts are more measured, but concrete outcomes emerge. Chinese purchases of American soybeans will resume immediately. China will pause countermeasures related to Washington's 301 investigation for a year. Trump agrees to reduce fentanyl-related tariffs. On rare earths, China agrees to delay some export controls. Both sides commit to establishing regular high-level dialogues. They schedule future presidential meetings. November 7th and 9th, the Ministry of Commerce announces a 1-year delay on certain rare earth export controls. November 10th, Trump reduces the fentanyl tariff to 10% and suspends heightened reciprocal tariffs until November 2026, maintaining only the baseline 10% reciprocal tariff. It's a truce, not a resolution. Both sides can claim victory. Trump points to resumed agricultural purchases. Xi notes that core Chinese policies remain intact. This is almost exactly what happened in the 1920s. By the late 1920s, both Portugal and Spain needed a settlement. Emperor Charles V faced wars in Italy and the Protestant Reformation in Germany. He needed money urgently. He couldn't afford resources tied up in a distant conflict over islands whose location he couldn't prove. Portugal had achieved effective control over the spice trade through the eastern route. They didn't want Spanish competition disrupting their monopoly. Crucially, dynastic marriages strengthened ties between the crowns. Charles V married King John III of Portugal's sister. Charles's sister married King John III. Family ties created a framework for compromise. Both kingdoms understood the costs of continued conflict. Both wanted stability, but neither wanted to surrender their claims. April 22, 1529, the city of Zaragoza in Aragon. King John III of Portugal and Emperor Charles V sign a treaty resolving the Moluccs dispute. The terms are straightforward. An anti-meridian is established 297.5 leagues east of the Moluccs. This places the Spice Islands firmly within Portuguese sphere. Spain formally renounces its claims to the Moluccs and associated territories in exchange for payment. How much? 350,000 gold ducats. Spain is selling its claims to Portugal, not surrendering, not compromising, selling. This is extraordinary. Both kingdoms started by claiming the entire world belonged to them by divine right. Now one is literally putting a price on its claims and walking away. The payment schedule is specific: 150,000 ducats in Lisbon within 15 to 20 days, 30,000 ducats in Castile by May 20th, 70,000 ducats at the May Fair of Medina del Campo, 100,000 ducats at the October Fair. Portugal is effectively buying out Spain's interest in the spice trade. But there's a twist. The treaty includes a reverte clause, an escape option. Spain reserves the right to nullify the agreement if future evidence proves the Moluccas actually lie east of the true anti-meridian. Spain could theoretically repay the money and reclaim its rights. Under the treaty, Portugal gains control of all lands and seas west of the line, including all Asia and its neighboring islands discovered so far. Spain is left with most of the Pacific Ocean, which seems vast but empty. Although the Philippines isn't mentioned in the treaty, Spain implicitly relinquishes any claim because the islands lie well west of the line. Both sides get what they really need. Portugal secures its spice monopoly without ongoing military conflict. Spain gets an enormous cash payment to fund Charles V's European wars, plus the freedom to focus on exploiting the silver mines of Mexico and Peru, which are proving fantastically profitable. It's not a winner-take-all outcome. It's a divorce settlement. Each party takes what they value most and agrees to stay out of the other's territory. The treaty works, sort of. Portugal enjoys a near monopoly on the spice trade for the rest of the 16th century. They build an extensive network of fortresses and trading posts from Africa to India to the Moluccas to China and Japan.
The wealth flowing to Lisbon is extraordinary. For a brief moment, Portugal is one of the richest kingdoms in Europe. But Portuguese rule in the Moluccas is often brutal. Governors grow greedy and violent. Local sultanates resist. In 1570, Sultan Hairun of Ternate is assassinated. His son Babullah leads an uprising that successfully expels the Portuguese from Ternate, though they maintain positions elsewhere in the islands. Meanwhile, Spain finds its own path to Asian wealth. By 1542, King Charles V decides to colonize the Philippines, gambling that Portugal won't protest too vigorously because the archipelago has no spices. He's right. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi successfully establishes Spanish settlements, founding Cebu and then Manila. Crucially, Andrés de Urdaneta discovers the return route across the Pacific via a northern route. This makes the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade possible. For over 250 years, silver from Mexican mines flows to Manila, buying Chinese silk, porcelain, and other goods, which then flow back to Mexico and on to Spain. The Philippines becomes Spain's only major Asian colony and remains Spanish until 1898, one of the longest colonial relationships in history. But the Portuguese-Spanish duopoly doesn't last. By the end of the 16th century, Protestant maritime powers, particularly the Dutch and English, challenge Iberian dominance. Neither recognizes the Treaty of Tordesillas or Zaragoza as legitimate. When France's King Francis I heard about Tordesillas, he reportedly demanded to see Adam's will that divided the world between Spain and Portugal while excluding France. The Dutch, through their East India Company, prove especially aggressive. They establish control over the Spice Islands in the early 17th century through military force and shrewd alliances with local rulers. In 1521, they perpetuate a genocidal conquest of the Banda Islands, massacring or enslaving much of the population to establish complete control over nutmeg production. The spice trade that drove centuries of exploration eventually declines. In the late 18th century, spice plants are successfully transplanted to other tropical regions, breaking the Moluccas' natural monopoly. A French missionary smuggles nutmeg seedlings to Madagascar, Mauritius, and Zanzibar. The islands that Portugal and Spain fought over for decades are largely forgotten. January 2026. We're right back where we started. Current tariff rates on Chinese goods remain elevated compared to historical norms, but well below the April 2025 peaks. The baseline includes Trump's 10% reciprocal tariff, plus various product-specific tariffs. The effective rate sits around 30 to 40%, depending on the product. Despite aggressive tariffs, China ended 2025 with $1 trillion trade surplus for the first time. External demand continued powering growth. Chinese exporters adapted, routing products through Southeast Asia and Mexico, finding alternative markets. American exports to China were down 40% year over year in the third quarter, but the shortfall was eclipsed by gains elsewhere. Chinese shipments to Asia, Mexico, Europe, and the Middle East continued to expand. The tariffs hurt bilateral trade, but didn't fundamentally reorder global trade patterns the way Trump hoped. On semiconductors, the situation remains contradictory. Trump's December 2025 decision allowing NVIDIA to sell H200 chips to select Chinese buyers, with the U.S. government taking a 25% revenue share, represents an unprecedented approach. It's simultaneously a restriction and an opening. China can access some advanced chips, but not the top-tier ones, and America takes a cut of every sale. Major U.S. firms reportedly agreed to give the government a 15% revenue cut on Chinese sales, a concession that was part of the deal to secure export licenses. Yet Trump continues blocking certain Chinese acquisitions. On January 2, 2026, he blocked a $3 million acquisition of EMCOR's New Jersey assets by a U.S. photonics firm with links to China, citing national security concerns.
The fundamental question remains, can export controls maintain U.S. leadership in AI, or do they simply push China to develop domestic alternatives faster? The evidence is mixed. China reportedly delayed its 5-nanometer chip release until at least 2026. ASMC's 7-nanometer process faces yield and reliability issues. Export controls are having some effect. But if the U.S. allowed unrestricted H200 exports, it would shrink America's advantage in AI compute from between 21 to 49 times to between 6.7 to 1.2 times, depending on Chinese demand scale. That's still an advantage, but a dramatically smaller one. China's rare earth restrictions remain partially in place. The Busal Agreement produced a 1-year delay on some controls, expiring in late 2026, but China maintained the licensing system introduced in April 2025. Beijing kept controls on tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum, and indium intact. Development timelines for Western alternative supply chains align with 2026 to 2027 capacity build-out. Until then, heavy rare earth elements command prices 3 to 4 times Chinese quoted prices in non-Chinese markets. China faces its own calculations. Game theory suggests their export controls aren't designed for long-term supply withdrawal, but as calculated strategic play. Maintaining enough market dependency preserves China's position without triggering permanent exodus from its processing ecosystem. So where does this end? History suggests neither complete victory nor stable equilibrium, but rather geographic and technological divorce. The Treaty of Zaragoza didn't resolve the fundamental competition between Portugal and Spain. It acknowledged that competition couldn't be resolved and created a framework for managing it. Each power got a sphere of influence. Each agreed to stay out of the other's territory. Both found ways to profit without destroying each other. The modern equivalent isn't a grand bargain where America and China agree on technology transfer terms or settle their ideological differences. It's a managed decoupling where each power develops its own technological ecosystem with minimal interdependence. We're already seeing this emerge. The United States is building a coalition of allied democracies, the Tier 1 countries from Biden's AI diffusion rule. These countries will share advanced technology, coordinate on export controls, and integrate their supply chains. This includes Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and others. China is building its own sphere through the Belt and Road Initiative and technology partnerships. Chinese companies are establishing semiconductor fabrication plants, AI research centers, and telecommunications networks across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These may not match cutting-edge Western technology initially, but they'll be independent of Western control. The prediction, by 2030, we'll have 2 largely separate technological worlds, one centered on American chip architecture, AI models, and software ecosystems, another centered on Chinese alternatives. Countries will have to choose which system to join, just as countries once had to choose whether to trade with Portuguese or Spanish merchants. Trump is scheduled to visit Beijing in April 2026, his first visit to China during his second term. Chinese leaders believe meaningful talks about sensitive issues like Taiwan should happen during a proper state visit, where home ground advantage grants more time and bandwidth for comprehensive deal striking. But Beijing remembers Trump's 2017 state visit with all its pomp and pageantry. It didn't sustain bilateral stability. It preceded the 2018 trade confrontation. Personal rapport between leaders hasn't proven sufficient to resolve deep structural conflicts. The most realistic forecast isn't a clean break, nor a reset, but a longer era of managed confrontation. Each side tries to deny the other decisive advantage in frontier technology and security, while selectively preserving economic channels that prevent immediate self-harm. But there's one factor that didn't exist in the 16th century: the energy constraint on AI. Training and running advanced AI models requires enormous amounts of electricity. The race for AI dominance is increasingly a race for energy. China has significant advantages here. China's energy infrastructure is more centralized. Their government can direct power resources toward strategic priorities more easily than market-driven Western democracies. China is also building out renewable energy capacity faster than any other nation. The United States faces challenges scaling power generation quickly enough to meet AI demands. Data centers are competing with residential and commercial users for limited electricity supply in key regions. The country that solves the energy puzzle may gain the decisive edge in AI deployment, regardless of who has the most advanced chips. This is a variable the 16th century powers didn't face. The spice trade required ships, sailors, and navigation skill. But once you had those resources, scale was relatively linear. One more ship meant one more cargo of spices. AI doesn't scale linearly. The energy requirements for cutting-edge models are exponential, and energy infrastructure takes decades to build. The most dangerous parallel between the 16th century and today isn't about economics, it's about miscalculation. The Moluccas rivalry never escalated to full-scale war between Portugal and Spain because both powers understood the costs would exceed the benefits. They had competing interests but shared Catholic identity and faced common external threats from Ottoman and Protestant powers. The US-China rivalry has no such safeguards.
Taiwan represents a potential flashpoint where economic competition could escalate to military confrontation. China views Taiwan as a core national interest. The United States has strategic ambiguity about whether it would defend Taiwan militarily. Taiwan also happens to be home to TSMC, the company that makes the world's most advanced semiconductors. If China controlled Taiwan, it would control the semiconductor supply chain that powers global AI development. This creates a nightmare scenario, a geopolitical dispute over territory that's also the most strategically valuable piece of technological infrastructure on Earth. When Portugal and Spain couldn't agree on the Moluccas, they negotiated. When negotiations failed, they went back to negotiating. War remained a threat but never became reality between these two Catholic powers. When the Dutch arrived, however, they had no such restraints. The Dutch were Protestant, not Catholic. They didn't recognize papal authority, they didn't share cultural identity with the Iberians, and they were willing to use extreme violence to seize control of the spice trade. The question for the 21st century is whether China and the United States can maintain the restraint Portugal and Spain showed, or whether a third party, a catalyst event, or simple miscalculation pushes the rivalry into open conflict. Here's the deepest parallel, the one that gives this documentary its title. The Treaty of Tordesillas drew a line through the Atlantic, but it said nothing about the opposite side of the world. Where was the anti-meridian? Where did Portuguese rights end and Spanish rights begin when you went all the way around? Nobody knew. The technology to measure longitude didn't exist. The maps were guesses. The negotiations were theater performed by experts who couldn't actually determine what they were arguing about. For 35 years, this ambiguity created conflict, competition, and ultimately the need for a second treaty to clarify what the first treaty had left unsaid. Today's anti-meridian is the boundary between legitimate security concerns and economic protectionism, between strategic competition and technological cooperation, between national sovereignty and global integration. Where exactly is that line? Nobody knows. The US-China rivalry is being fought over boundaries that neither side can clearly define. What constitutes a national security threat in AI? At what level of technological capability does a dual-use technology become primarily military? How much economic interdependence is compatible with strategic competition? These questions don't have clear answers. The experts disagree. The technology is evolving faster than policy frameworks can adapt. Both sides are making up the rules as they go, just like Portuguese and Spanish cartographers drawing lines on maps of a world they didn't fully understand. The Treaty of Zaragoza resolved the Moluccas dispute by acknowledging this fundamental uncertainty and working around it. Spain sold its ambiguous claims for a concrete payment. Portugal bought certainty at a high price. Both sides could live with the outcome, even though the underlying geographic questions remained unresolved. The modern Zaragoza will likely follow the same pattern. Neither the United States nor China will decisively win the technology competition. Neither will surrender their core interests. Instead, they'll find a way to divide the technological world into spheres where each can dominate without directly threatening the other's vital interests. This isn't satisfying. It doesn't resolve the ideological differences. It doesn't create a stable new world order, but it prevents catastrophic conflict while allowing both powers to pursue their interests. So what does the 500-year-old ghost teach us? First lesson, rivalry doesn't require resolution. Portugal and Spain competed for decades over the Spice Islands. They signed treaties, violated treaties, negotiated new treaties. They established spheres of influence that constantly shifted. Neither side ever decisively defeated the other. Eventually, both were displaced by powers that didn't exist when the rivalry began. The US-China rivalry will likely follow the same arc. Periods of heightened tension followed by tactical truces, aggressive rhetoric followed by pragmatic accommodation, no return to the integrated relationship of the past, no stable new equilibrium, just managed confrontation extending indefinitely. Second lesson, alternative routes exist, even if they're harder. Magellan proved Spain could reach Asia by sailing west. It was longer, more dangerous, more expensive than Portugal's eastern route. Most ships didn't make it, but one ship proving the route was viable changed everything. China is proving alternative technological paths exist. They may be less efficient initially, they may require more investment and produce more failures, but if China can demonstrate that competitive AI, advanced semiconductors, and cutting-edge technology can be developed without American cooperation, the entire export control strategy loses its foundation. Third lesson, wealth changes hands regardless of who draws the boundaries. Portugal secured its sphere of influence through Zaragoza. Spain paid for the privilege of focusing elsewhere. But within a century, the Dutch had seized control of the spice trade from both of them, and eventually, the spice trade itself declined in importance, leaving the original rivals wondering what they'd fought so hard to control. The United States and China are competing for technologies that may become commoditized or superseded within decades. AI architectures that seem revolutionary today may be routine tomorrow. Semiconductor manufacturing techniques that require billions in investment now may be accessible to dozens of countries in 20 years. The rivalry is real, the stakes are high, but history suggests the greatest rewards often go not to the initial competitors, but to those who exploit the infrastructure they build. Fourth lesson, the rest of the world isn't just watching. When Portugal and Spain divided the world between themselves, they didn't ask permission from the peoples who lived in those territories. But those peoples had their own agency. Local sultanates in the Moluccas played Portuguese and Spanish rivals against each other. Indigenous populations resisted, adapted, and sometimes expelled their would-be colonizers. Today, countries from India to Brazil to Vietnam to Saudi Arabia are carefully navigating between American and Chinese spheres of influence. They're not passive observers. They're actively shaping outcomes by choosing which technologies to adopt, which partners to align with, which rules to accept or reject. The US-China rivalry will be resolved not just by decisions in Washington and Beijing, but by choices made in dozens of capitals around the world. April 2026 approaches. Trump visits Beijing. Will this be the moment for a modern Zaragoza, a grand bargain that establishes clear spheres of influence and prevents further escalation? Or will it be another temporary truce like Geneva or Busan that papers over fundamental disagreements without resolving them? The ghost of the ante-meridian suggests the latter, not because leaders lack goodwill or wisdom, but because some competitions resist resolution. The boundaries are too ambiguous, the stakes are too high, the technologies are evolving too fast. Portugal and Spain needed 35 years and 2 major treaties to sort out their rivalry. Even then, they didn't truly resolve it. They managed it until other powers displaced them both. The US-China rivalry has been building for less than a decade in its current form. It may take decades more to find a stable framework, if such a framework is even possible.
The most likely outcome is technological bifurcation. Two systems, two standards, two supply chains. Countries choosing sides not through military alliance, but through infrastructure choices that lock them into one ecosystem or another. This isn't the catastrophe some fear. The world functioned with rival spheres during the Cold War. International trade and cultural exchange continued, even between adversaries. But it's not the integrated global economy that prevailed from the 1990s through the 2010s. That world is gone. The ghost has seen to that. The Treaty of Tordesillas was signed in 1494, the Treaty of Zaragoza in 1529, 35 years to go from initial division to practical resolution. Trump's first tariffs on China were imposed in 2018. By that timeline, we won't see final resolution until the early 2050s. Most people reading this will spend decades navigating a divided technological world. But here's the thing about ghosts. They teach us what to expect, not what to fear. Portuguese and Spanish merchants found ways to profit even during peak rivalry. Trade didn't stop. Technology didn't stop advancing. Human ingenuity didn't wait for political resolution. The same will be true today. American and Chinese companies will find ways to cooperate even as their governments compete. Technologies will diffuse across boundaries despite export controls. People will continue innovating regardless of tariff rates or diplomatic tensions. The rivalry is real, the competition is intense, the consequences are significant. But history teaches us that human creativity and adaptability exceed any government's ability to control outcomes. The world that emerges from this rivalry won't look like what either Beijing or Washington plans. It'll look like what billions of people around the world create through their daily choices, actions, and innovations. The 500-year-old ghost isn't a prophecy of doom. It's a reminder that we've been here before. Different technologies, different powers, same human patterns. Portugal and Spain thought they were dividing the world forever. Within a century, their treaties were footnotes. The Dutch, English, French, and others redrew every boundary. The United States and China think they're competing for permanent dominance, but the technologies they're fighting over today will be commoditized tomorrow. New powers will emerge with new capabilities. The boundaries being drawn now will seem quaint to future generations. The anti-meridian remains ambiguous. It always has been. It always will be. And perhaps that ambiguity, that fundamental uncertainty about where one sphere ends and another begins, is not a bug in the system, but a feature. It's what keeps the rivalry from becoming annihilation. It's what forces both sides to keep negotiating, keep adapting, keep searching for workable compromises rather than final solutions. The ghost is patient. It's been haunting us for 500 years. It can wait a few more decades.